Lord Robert Cecil, A View of the American Civil War from an Anti-Union British Conservative.
So a little bit about Lord Robert Cecil's early life. He was born February 3rd in Hatfield, England, and he died on August 22nd, 1903, also in Hatfield, England. He was known for being a British conservative politician, and a lot of people would say that he paved the way for certain viewpoints during this time period. And as his time as prime minister, he served for about 13 years or so. And he not only that, he was also politically involved in other positions. But a little important backstory about his early life is that he is the son of Marquis of Salisbury. So ever since his early life, he had connections to like estates or just like valuable connections. Next slide, please. So his place in history, he was a strong supporter of the Confederacy. And then I included this little part of a bibliography where it said that he was opposed to alliance commitments, fearing that when time came, the Democratic electorate might refuse to go to war. He also regarded alliances for for Britain as unnecessary and dangerous. So that kind of just gives off his viewpoint and just like getting involved with alliances and just like um how he viewed like his responsibilities to his nation, I guess you could say. Next slide, please. So Lord Robert Cecil's involvement in the Civil War, he was a pretty well-known politician, but a lot of people would consider him a statesman just because of the effects of his work he I wouldn't say provided but contributed to. So when it came down to the Civil War, he took more approaches that would benefit the nation. So rather than shifting his focus from the British government and starting alliances, he rather, like I said before, he would rather like focus on what was going on in his nation and what he can control rather than get involved in other situations. Um, yeah. Next slide.
An overwhelming majority of British society looked down upon slavery when the American Civil War broke out, as did British conservatives. However, many British conservatives sympathized with the South due to cultural similarities between the two groups, pro-Confederate propaganda that was circulating at the time, and their shared disdain for Federalist policy. Cecil was one of the most outspoken pro-Confederacy conservative members of the British government. So supporting the South aligned with his anti-federalist ideals. Next slide. While historical letters show and records show that the British politics largely ignored the American Civil War and focused on issues closer to home, they had particular trouble stifling Cecil for just his way of avoiding political alliances, as was alluded to before. Cecil primarily used the American Civil War to support his conservative agenda by portraying the advancement of democracy and federalist ideals in the American North as a threat to the wealthy landowners in Britain. Next slide. Abraham Lincoln and his associates got Americans in the North to stand behind the Union's war efforts against the South by calling for a unified nation of sovereign states that represented by one organized central government. Therefore, most Americans in the North viewed the Civil War as a way to keep the nation unified against the secession in the South, while the South attempted to secede and create its own decentralized government to protect their states' rights, the institution of slavery, and disagreements over tariffs. Next slide. So where does Britain come in this? Well, because Cecil and the British conservatives could not replace the government at the time, he and other British pro-Confederate conservative politicians saw the Civil War as a way to spread their anti-federalist rhetoric in the hopes of gaining traction with voters in the upcoming election cycle. So they were just, looking to improve or jump on the trend of anti-federalist viewpoints in the country at the time. Next slide.
All right, so in the case of Robert Cecil, He did not have his opinions change very much over time. He held on to his 19th century notions and was seen as a very conservative man throughout his political career. He was quoted by Dick Leonard to be the first 20th century prime minister who was quintessentially a 19th century figure. He was a staunch supporter of the Confederacy, as can be seen in these newspaper articles from The Spectator in 1863. It was reported that during a council meeting, only last week he launched against Mr. W.E. Forrester for the epithet of a federal sign-on the ground that he wished to betray the Confederates into defeat. And he also wasn't seen as great by the public, perhaps because of his support of the Confederacy and not being outwardly against slavery. He's quoted as Lord Robert Cecil is incapable of understanding the nobler and more earnest convictions of the day. How this betters our understanding of the U.S. Civil War because it shows us different points of view for a huge moment within history. It sparked international conversation with Lord Robert Cecil. You could see Federalists versus non-Federalists. People argued over whether or not they supported slavery and the Union or the Confederacy. It affected trade, most importantly for Lord Robert Cecil, cotton. We could see within this week's reading, he victimizes the South and demonizes the North on business and how they affected trade. And then we also see this within Lord Robert Cecil, this idea of holding on to the conservative ideals.